What like? So I'm sat at the shores of Loch Ruthven, a loch that I mentioned in my previous video, very close to Loch Dantelchig, and for my sins I genuinely can't remember the name of the third one, despite the fact somebody in my comments, well my missus said in the comments, in the previous video the name of it I just can't remember. It's a very peaceful loch in all honesty. There's a little car park, a little path following the car park that takes you sort of through a man-made path through the trees, and it takes you along the shoreline. But never once in my travels have I bumped into anybody out here, despite the fact quite often there's the odd car in the car park. Strange, makes me question whether or not there's a legitimate path and I've just found some sort of hiker's path. Nonetheless, here I am. And yet again, there's a few things that I wish to speak about. But I'm finding it hard to set an itinerary for a video, for this video even, purely because there's a few things that I wish to speak about. The way that my mind tends to operate when it comes to making videos is, albeit they're impromptu, never like scripts or anything are required, there's usually something that I have to focus on and I'll just sort of elaborate when I start speaking. I'm really struggling today purely because there's a few things. But I think probably what I'll start with is the term scapegoating migrants. It's a term we've all heard, it's a sort of nebulous term. If anything, it's just a buzzword. But it's a rebuttal that gets used quite often by human rights lawyers, politicians, activists, etc. when it comes to defending migrants, but more specifically illegal migrants. In this context, you know, the people in hotels, etc. They usually throw that at people that oppose the idea of hotels being used to house illegal migrants while their asylum applications get processed. So people oppose this for whatever reason. Then you'll have people on the other side coming out and saying, you're just scapegoating migrants. This all, of course, has been going on for some time, but in recent weeks, in the Highlands of Scotland, the Inverness Courier posted a story, and I genuinely cannot remember the statistics per se, so I'm not going to spend time bullshitting whoever's listening to this by coming up with phony numbers, but one number that did stick out was 9,000 plus people on waiting lists in Scotland for social/affordable housing. You know, and Inverness has been the fastest growing city, or was the fastest growing city in Europe for the best part of a decade. A city that was voted as the most happy place to live in 2014. A city that's seen its population double since the 1940s/50s. But in spite of that fact, with a rising population and it being pretty rapid, accelerating in pace when it comes to its growth, the question has to be asked as to who's filling up these houses. At a time, especially nowadays, where mortgages are sky high, you do have to wonder who's moving in. It's not locals, that's for sure. Renting, yes, but as I said, they sort of fall into the same category as the rest of, you know, affordable and social, etc. I'm not directly throwing the blame solely at the feet of the concept of immigration, but it does play a part, surely. It has to play a part. If waiting lists exist, and it's taking an awful long time for these waiting lists to be reduced in numbers, surely the importation of people would exacerbate these figures, exacerbate this issue. But yet, if you suggest this, you're scapegoating migrants. You could kind of flip that on its head. The insinuation that you're scapegoating migrants by simply pointing out the fact that immigration, at least at the very bare minimum, plays a slight part in an issue such as social housing or waiting lists in general. You could throw that on its head and suggest that the people who have an issue with this and call you the scapegoater of the migrants, they're just inconsistent. Absolutely inconsistent. Treacherous or manipulative, deceptive even, disingenuous. You know, there's a multitude of buzzwords you could throw directly back at them in response. And what I mean by that is they will use every justification possible, but they will always deliberately leave out immigration as one. lack of funding, COVID, Brexit, etc. These are the sort of excuses that you will hear from people whenever the issue of waiting lists increasing is brought to the forefront. Now, this isn't just limited to housing, of course. You've got dentists, NHS waiting lists, school placements are becoming more and more of an issue in specific parts of the country, not just Scotland, across the UK. You know, services in general are becoming pressurised, and yet every issue, or every excuse possible, is brought to the forefront to push away or brush away the issue, but never once do they touch upon the fact that immigration is part of it. And when I say inconsistent, I mean that if they were genuinely sincere, if there was sincerity in the people who claim that they really care about these issues, they would, at the very bare minimum, acknowledge that immigration has to be playing a factor. Right? It's all very well and good to blame a lack of funding, or in the SNP's case, blame Westminster. It's all very well and good to stand at your podiums or whatever you do and argue the case that more needs to be done to solve the housing crisis, more needs to be done to solve the crisis in the NHS. Everything's a fucking crisis these days. But it's all just waffle as far as I'm concerned if you're not prepared to, or you deliberately leave out that immigration has to play at the very bare minimum a slight factor in all of this. You're full of shit. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the reason that they do this is because if they were to sort of concede that immigration does play a factor, irrespective of how little or how much of a factor, if they were to concede that immigration exacerbates the issue slightly or majorly, they would be giving ground to their opponents who oppose these issues. As I said, inconsistent with their claims of caring, deceptive, manipulative, etc. But it's pretty sad, really, in many respects, that such a waiting list exists, and this is not just limited to the Highlands. It's a lot worse in other parts of the country. And it never used to be this bad. Immigration has to play a factor. Of course it does. The same with the NHS, the same with everything. In fact, there was a video that I posted to my Telegram channel just today speaking about plans for Academy Street in Inverness. This is part of a much larger project that they've been talking about in part over the course of the past few years. They wish to effectively eradicate cars and buses, etc. from, well, buses no, because they're classified as sustainable and electric, but they want to effectively change one of the main streets in Inverness to just be completely public footfall and no cars or anything. And they speak about the fact that everything's congested, and I'm not disputing the fact that it is congested. But there's two things I wish to bring up here. The first being protocols that were put into place when the COVID nonsense started in 2020. They put up barriers, etc., across many of the main streets in Inverness's very small city centre. The excuse that the Highland Council used at the time was that this was to allow for social distancing to occur outside shops, right? So they effectively changed some of the streets to one way. They put up poles or bollards in other parts of the city in this area. And it was supposed to be a temporary measure. I'll go figure. The Highland Council came out probably November, October time of 2020 to say that this was going to now be a permanent measure. Right. And one of the reasons that they gave was that it was reducing CO2 emissions, because a lot of people avoided the city and whatnot, you know, in their car, etc. But my point to bringing that up is that in this latest proposal that's been put forth, they released a video on the Highland Council's YouTube channel. And they brought up congestion and how it's unsightly and it's too busy and etc, etc, etc. Right, it's always been kind of busy since I can remember, but it looks an awful lot worse now since these bollards are up. Right, these poles that go along the side of the streets, right? Some of these roads have been turned into bike lanes, etc. It's a bit of a shambles. It looks pretty damn unsightly, right? But they're now playing on the fact, as far as I'm concerned, they're playing on the fact that it looks unsightly and people are more susceptible to that, right? They don't seem to remember a time before that. And as I said, yes, it was somewhat busy, point I'll come to in a second, but it looks a lot worse now due to their measures that they put in place. And now they're sort of nudging people in the right direction towards agreement. Yeah, let's get rid of cars around the city centre of Inverness because of all the congestion, right? There's always been an aspect of that, but it looks a lot worse now. Second point brings me back full circle. Immigration has to be added into the fact. Yes, tourism plays a part, but all year round, Inverness is a lot busier than it once was. In fact, in this video from the Highland Council's YouTube channel, they make reference to the fact that a lot of the roads in the centre of Inverness were actually built for horses and carts. It's not funny, right? But even past past the fact, or past the days even, where horses and carts were the main mode of transport around Inverness, there would have been cars on the road, right? Then, as people, access to vehicles became more and more accessible and cheap, etc., more and more cars would have appeared on the road. But now, as it's now one of the fastest growing cities in Europe, as I said, who's moving in, can't be denied that immigration must be playing somewhat of a factor in that. But no, can't talk about that because you're scapegoating migrants. But as I said, I'm not making this video to just simply talk about immigration. No whatsoever. There's a few things that have been played in my head. Immigration obviously comes into it to some degree. And it does irritate me how it's never brought up when it comes to suggesting solutions or highlighting issues. And how do we rectify them? Well, we can't talk about immigration. No, because you're scapegoating migrants. School placements, NHS, etc. NHS is a real irritating one because they always talk about how if it wasn't for the immigrants, the migrants, then the NHS would be on its knees. But it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in many respects when it comes to the NHS, because you have to import more and more people to cater to the more and more people that are already here.